This week's absurdity, white privilege. We're going to dive into what white privilege is, and I'm going to show you some examples and some things that you can do about it. What's up everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm Ryan Becker, and every week I drop a new video where I talk about absurd issues in religion, culture, and society. If you're new here, thanks for stopping by. Make sure to subscribe to my channel and like this video to help it reach more people. First, let's define it. What is white privilege? Well, white privilege is the idea that white or white-passing people have inherent advantages, both socially and economically, simply because of the color of their skin. Many people believe white privilege is a myth, and they would argue that white privilege doesn't exist because they had to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, or because they've had experiences that counter the white privilege narrative. The problem with this line of thinking is that exceptions do not make the rule. So while yes, you personally may have had a rough go at it, this does not mean that white privilege as a whole doesn't exist. Properly understanding white privilege can help us identify ways to provide better opportunities for other groups of people. The problem isn't that white people are advantaged. The problem is that people of color are unnecessarily disadvantaged. White privilege is something that is very difficult to quantify, mainly because there is no set way to measure our experiences. One reality of white privilege is that there are certain things you just don't experience but others do. So how can you measure experiences that you didn't even have? How can you determine that the reason you didn't even have those experiences to begin with is your skin color? The answer, it turns out, is to look for what you don't see. Let me explain this via one main issue: representation. I'll also reference one direct economic example, and I'll be giving practical solutions we can work on even now. When we talk about education, representation is amplified. If you went to a typical elementary, middle, or high school, you probably didn't learn that Christopher Columbus was a ruthless, racist man until after you graduated. You probably didn't learn until later that many of the founding fathers in America wrote the words, "All men are created equal," while simultaneously owning black people as slaves. You may have learned that Martin Luther King Jr. was a hero of the civil rights movement, and you've touted him as the best example of appropriate activism. But you didn't learn until later that MLK was actually hated in his day and imprisoned more times than we can count for the very things that we praise him for. These are all examples of white privilege, where you were exposed to a certain filtered version of history instead of the reality, and it wasn't even your choice. Continuing with representation, when young people are growing up, they often look at famous heroes in history to decide what they want to be when they grow up and what career path they want to work toward. They also look at those currently in positions of power or influence. In the US in 2018, 77% of police and 83% of firefighters were white. There were 44 white presidents, but only one black president. We have Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin as the go-to astronauts for inspiration. And out of over 2,100 billionaires in the world, less than 20 of them are black. What message does that send regarding the possibilities for someone's life? How impressionable is that for a young child who may be going through school learning about all the famous, successful people of history and of today, but rarely seeing people of color in those same positions? When most major figures we teach kids about in school are white, it sends an implicit message that success will be harder to obtain if someone isn't white, or that those accomplishments and positions aren't for people of color. It's not that white people are shown the possibilities for their future and what they could become. It's that students of color aren't. Everyone deserves the same opportunity for inspiration and to accomplish great things. But if people of color want to learn about those historical figures in school, they usually have to take an extra class on top of their required classes. It isn't equal opportunity, it's extra work. For white people, the standard required history classes will do that for them. It sends the message that this history, which mainly involves the successes of white people, is more integral to know about than that other history over there. The privilege here is that underrepresentation in success stories and education is very rarely a concern that white people realize normally. Speaking of normal, for people of color, being the minority in the room is normal and makes a majority of their lived group experiences. Being slightly uncomfortable and being in environments where the things weren't for them isn't something they can escape because, and here's one of the most painful realities for people of color, for someone to be successful, they usually have to assimilate into and succeed in traditionally white majority spaces. There is almost no path of professional success for a person of color in America that doesn't involve having to do just that. For white people, these spaces require little to no adjustment, obviously, But for people of color, it's different. Anytime you've ever heard a person of color be told they speak so proper compared to other people of color, this is because these individuals are code switching, which is when someone mimics the accepted inflection and vernacular of their current environment to blend in. It's something they have to do every single day in school or at work in order to succeed. Many white people I know can probably count the number of times they have been the minority in a room, literally. Each time that's been the case, they likely have felt some sort of unease or discomfort. If it's happened to you, you may have felt like whatever you were experiencing wasn't really for you. You may have even felt a little relieved when the experience was over and you were back to your normal environment. It is a privilege to navigate the path to success or even progress in your job in spaces where the majority look and talk like you do. Now, I want to give one direct economic example. In 2018, Wells Fargo was forced to pay $175 million because they had engaged in predatory lending toward more than 30,000 minority borrowers between 2004 and 2009. The DOJ claimed Wells Fargo had charged Black and Hispanic borrowers higher rates and fees for home loans, even if they qualified for better ones. If you were white, you likely walked in, got a loan, and didn't even think twice about it. This was seen as a victory for the Department of Justice for punishing wrongs. But there were so many people who lost their homes after being buried in debt and fees they couldn't afford. The loans were made between 2004 and 2009, yet Wells Fargo wasn't punished until over 10 years later. I couldn't find any instances where this was done to white people unless those individuals lived in certain neighborhoods or regions, redlining, and none of this was obvious when it happened, as it was only revealed a decade later when Wells Fargo was punished. People of color were buried in fees and debt, and many lost their homes, not generations ago, but now. While all of these factors are significant in and of themselves, when taken on aggregate, it shows the depth of the reality for people of color. Starting from a very young, impressionable age, people of color have fewer role models, less knowledge of their own history. They have to change themselves to fit in, and they can have a harder time securing some of the basic financial opportunities needed for American living. And that's my entire point here. The problem with white privilege isn't the white person. It's that many of the basic expectations and opportunities in life that are normal for those with white privilege are all too often a very tangible struggle for those without it. So we shouldn't talk about white privilege to tear white people down, but to show that those with privilege can help build others up. So I'm not here to guilt trip you or call you a racist just because you are white. I am hoping that you might become aware of different parts of culture that favor your complexion. Once you're aware of this, there are things that can be done to ensure that isn't the case for future generations. And yes, this is a generational work. If someone tells you that you have white privilege, it's likely something that you had no control over. You were raised in a system that disproportionately favored those who look like you. That's not your fault, and it's nothing that you need to be ashamed of. White privilege is meant to be used as a sort of magnifying glass, so you can examine and understand the differences between others' lived experiences and your own. Whenever we deny white privilege, even though it is quite observable in mainstream culture and at all levels of society, we are effectively gaslighting people of color into believing that their concerns are made up and their experiences aren't real. It's like the world's lamest Jedi mind trick attempt, and it just doesn't hold up.
Let me see your identification.
You don't need to see his identification.
We don't need to see his identification.
These aren't the droids you're looking for.
These aren't the droids we're looking for.
We see how ridiculous that scene is, and yet we do it all the time when people open up about their lived reality. Your personal white privilege becomes evil when you see your advantages and decide that others shouldn't have them. The greed to maintain those advantages and those privileges is the catalyst for racial discrimination and oppression. I'm not telling you that you have to accept that you have white privilege so that you will be ashamed of your lived experience. I'm not even telling it to you so that you will think you didn't earn what you have. I'm simply trying to help add perspective on what white privilege is, so that we can do more to make sure it becomes the norm for all of us. The overall comforts and advantages offered by the subtle experiences of white privilege, of which I have benefited, should be offered to everyone. Everyone should be treated fairly and receive justice. White privilege is looking at the current protests happening around the country right now and being able to tune them out because they don't apply to you. White privilege is being taught about more successful white people throughout history, while people of color are left out and white people's flaws are left out. White privilege is seeing yourself represented positively in music, movies, TV, and books, while people of color are stereotyped. White privilege is having more advantaged access to financial opportunities than people of color. Everyone should see successful people of their own background and heritage to look up to. Everyone should see themselves represented positively in the media. And everyone should have fair access to financial opportunities. And this is the last reality. For all of that to become real life, we must work alongside people of color to help raise the standard for them. One way is to develop more successful professionals of color that can be highlighted now and in the future upcoming generations. We should also close the gap that's caused by preferential treatment by educating ourselves on important historical figures of other ethnicities and seek their representation, and as we have opportunity, educate others on that representation. And when people of color celebrate representation in various media or education, we should celebrate right alongside them. When we enter a non-white majority space, we should ask why we are uncomfortable there versus other spaces in our lives. And we should seek to make white majority environments more friendly and comfortable for others without appropriating or patronizing someone else's culture. Don't use your white privilege to be ashamed of your upbringing, heritage, or accomplishments. Instead, use your understanding of white privilege as a bridge building tool. You can use it to help translate others' negative experiences into something tangible that can be addressed through practical action. Properly understanding your advantages can help you understand and empathize with someone else's disadvantages. That empathy can drive you to action to remove those disadvantages and to lift someone else up when others are keeping them down. I hope this has helped you further understand white privilege and what you can do to leverage any privilege that you have so that others can have the same. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and share it with your friends. And as always, here is my dog Sugar to see you off and brighten your day. Thanks for watching.